Hi, so today we're going to be talking about fats. We're going to be talking about lipid molecules, triglycerides, and we're going to talk about the importance of fats in our diet. Okay, so let's begin by kind of defining what is fat. And so fat molecules take many forms, and there's many variations on them. But for the most part, what we're talking about when we speak of fat is we're talking about molecules that kind of look like this. So they kind of have these long chains, but they're not certainly polymers. They're much shorter than polymers. But the type of chain is going to determine whether it is an oil, or whether it is like a hard cheese or something like that. So whether it's a butter, whether it's soft, or whether it exists in something like a fish or not. And so the molecular shape actually has quite a bit to say about what its physical properties are. Okay, so fat is where we get a lot of our energy from. And we talk about burning fat. And so why do we talk about burning fat? Well, hopefully you can see there's a close molecular with some similarities between something like octane, right, which gets burnt to form kind of a gas fire, and as well as something like this. This is a triglyceride, which is a fat molecule, and we can turn this into wax, right? And so when we're burning candles, what are we burning? We're burning a molecule that looks very, very, very similar to something like a hydrocarbon that we would burn to start a car. Okay, so a triglyceride molecule is how human body stores fat, and it really is kind of composed of three different fatty acid molecules. So you can see that there's one of them, and then we have a second one right here, and a third one right here, and it's kind of linked up on the side with this glycerol unit. So the triglyceride molecule can have a lot of different structural shapes and forms, and you can have double bonds, or you can have just straight up single bonds, and this is going to, as I said, define kind of the physical properties of the fat. One of the main differences is that some fat chains, which once again you're going to use as energy sources potentially, have unsaturation in them. So that is to say that they have double bonds. And so you can kind of see that right here. An oleic acid or arachidonic acid is going to have a whole bunch. Linoleic acid. So not only do they have a whole bunch of carbons in a row, but they potentially have some double bonds. And one of the things about double bonds is that they create these kind of kinks in the molecule. And so having a kink in the molecule means that the molecules don't stack very well anymore. So you could imagine that if you have a triglyceride here, and then you have three kind of straight molecules, that this is going to stack really well on another one of straight molecules. And this stacking is going to help order this system quite well, and this is going to ultimately result in a well orderly, tightly packed molecule, or a solid. And so this is an example of maybe butter. So butter is composed of these nice long linear fat molecules. However, if you have lots of kinks in your molecule, these don't stack very well. And in fact, it's really difficult to kind of put two of these triglycerides together. And because of that, these don't stack well. They tend to be more fluid and more movement. And so these are liquids. And so we call these oils. And so something like oleic acid is very high in oils, such as olive oil. Palmitic acid, on the other hand, is very high in things like butter. The current thinking right now is that, for whatever reason, that unsaturated fatty acids are better for your health than saturated. So that's to say that oils, things that have molecules that have these kinks in them, seem to do better for your overall health than eating a lot of saturated fatty acids, or molecules that kind of look like this. So oil is better than butter, although the science continues to change every day. Just in the same way that chemists and food scientists have generated non-caloric sweeteners, people have attempted to invent fat molecules that can evade the lipases. So the lipases, if you remember, are these important enzyme proteins that help break down the triglycerides that you eat into fatty acids so you can ultimately uptake them and you can burn them as energy sources. Well, chemists came up with olestra. This is a good example of a kind of a modified molecule. It actually has a sugar core to it, and the sugar has a whole bunch of these fatty acid chains coming off of it. And you taste it, and it kind of tastes like a fat would. And in fact, they put it into a lot of foods in the 70s and 80s, and made with olestra right here. That's the name of it. However, people found out that when you can't digest these fatty molecules, you tend to have rather explosive problems with the toilet later on. So these attempts to have fat-free alternatives were ultimately abandoned. Okay, so fat molecules are really quite important for us, and they're important for more than just energy sources, for long-term storage and long-term energy sources. And one of the really important things that they do is they actually make up the cellular membrane of our cells in our bodies. And so we're about 70% water, and we have both water inside our cells, and we have water outside our cells, and so the barrier that exists between the extracellular, the outer area, and the intracellular area is what's called a phospholipid bilayer. And so if you want to imagine here, we have these long tails of fat molecules, and here we have them right here, and they're going to be attached to a water-loving group, a phosphate group. And so we have both water-loving, hydrophilic, and water-hating, hydrophobic, and they kind of end up packing in this really neat way, which ultimately you get water-loving on the outside, and then you get water-loving on the inside, and you get this nice kind of water-hating part in the middle. And this actually makes a natural membrane that certain molecules can't pass through. Believe it or not, you actually understand this process. You understand the process by which fats that have polar groups on them, the like phosphates, for instance, the ones that make these phospholipid bilayers, you know how this works because you've used soap. And so what is a soap? Well, a soap is a detergent, basically it's a long chain tail, and then you have this water-loving kind of part to the front end of it. And so what happens is that maybe you have grease on your pot or your pan, and you add water to it. Well, water and grease repel each other, so the water does a pretty bad job of trying to remove the grease. And yet, when you add soap to it, what happens is the soap, the grease-loving part, the tail here, inserts itself into the soap, but then the water-loving part kind of is on the surface, and ultimately this can kind of surround the grease molecule and kind of break it up into these little kind of micelles, or these little blobs, and get washed away in the water, and ultimately you're left with a clean surface.